There is a moment, just before something is lost forever, when the world holds its breath. No drum roll, no darkening of the sky, no sign visible to the people living through them that this particular morning is different from any other, that the hours unfolding around them carry within them something that will be remembered, mourned, and studied for centuries to come. The people of those days wake up and eat their breakfast and go about their business, and the catastrophe, or the miracle, or the turning point, arrives in its own time, indifferent to their expectations. Sometimes that moment lasts only a few seconds. A stumble at the edge of a cliff, a candle tipping toward a curtain, a door closing for the last time. The world does not mark these moments. It simply continues. And in the ordinary turning of days and seasons, those brief, breathless seconds are swallowed by time and forgotten. But sometimes, not often, but sometimes, the world witnesses, and the loss becomes something else entirely, something that echoes down through the centuries and refuses, quietly and insistently, to be forgotten. On a warm July afternoon in the year 1545, one of the most powerful warships the Kingdom of England had ever produced slipped beneath the waters of the Solent, the narrow channel of sea that separates the English mainland from the Isle of Wight. She went down in a matter of minutes, perhaps less, and she took with her somewhere between 400 and 500 souls, men who had served aboard her, breathed the salt air of that channel, and found no way out in the chaos of those final tilting moments. The ship's name was the Mary Rose, and watching from the shore, close enough to see it all with his own eyes, was King Henry VIII himself. We must pause here for just a moment, because it is worth letting that image settle. A king, one of the most formidable, most fearsome, most recognizable monarchs in all of English history, standing on the southern coast of his own kingdom, watching his flagship, his pride, his great instrument of war, disappear beneath the water. The accounts that survive from that day speak of the king's distress, of cries, of anguish. The men aboard the Mary Rose were, in many cases, men he knew personally. Her captain, Sir George Carew, was a man of some standing at court. The screams of the dying, it is said, carried across the water to the royal party on shore. History rarely offers us a scene quite so vivid, quite so human as that one. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. But the story of the Mary Rose is not only a story of that single terrible afternoon, it stretches back more than 3 decades, to the earliest years of Henry's reign, to a time when the young king was flush with ambition, eager to prove himself the equal of the great monarchs of Europe, and determined to build an English navy that the world could not ignore. The Mary Rose was one of the first great expressions of that ambition. She was laid down around 1510 and launched the following year among the earliest purpose-built warships in the English fleet. Not a converted merchant vessel pressed into military service, but a ship conceived from her very keel as a weapon of war. She was remarkable for her time in ways that are easy to underestimate from a distance of 5 centuries. The Mary Rose was one of the first ships in the world to carry heavy guns mounted in her hull, fired through a revolutionary new feature called gun ports, hinged openings cut into the ship's side that allowed broadside cannons to be used at sea in a way that had simply not been possible before. This was not a small innovation. This was, in the truest sense of the phrase, a change in the nature of naval warfare. Before ships like the Mary Rose, sea battles were largely decided by boarding, by sailing close, throwing grappling hooks, and fighting hand-to-hand across the enemy's deck with heavy broadside artillery. A warship could now stand off at distance and destroy. She served the English crown for 34 years. 34 years of patrols and skirmishes, of French wars and diplomatic posturing, of refit and repair and the slow, relentless aging of an oak hull in salt water. She was rebuilt at least once. She was loved, it seems, in the particular way that sailors love a good ship, with a kind of quiet, unspoken trust. She was not the largest warship of her age, but she was experienced, seasoned, known. And on the 19th of July, 1545, on what should have been a proud afternoon, an English fleet sailing out to meet a French invasion force, with the King of England watching. She was gone. What followed is a story that spans not years, not decades, but centuries. A story of a ship that was not truly lost, but only waiting. Because in 1982, the Mary Rose came back, raised from the silt of the Solent where she had rested for 437 years. She was brought to the surface largely intact. A ghost ship, a time capsule, a window into a world that had vanished long before anyone alive could remember it. Aboard her, preserved in the cold dark, were the possessions of her crew, their tools, their clothing, their dice, and their longbows, and their surgeons' instruments. Even, in some cases, their bones. The Mary Rose did not just survive. She remembered. And that, in the end, is what makes her so extraordinary. Not merely the drama of her sinking, nor the spectacle of her raising, but the extraordinary intimacy of what she preserved. She is not simply a shipwreck. She is a portrait of Tudor England, rendered in oak and iron, and the quiet, patient testimony of the men who sailed her. This is her story. And we have time. So let us begin at the beginning. To understand the Mary Rose, you must first understand the England that built her. And to understand that England, you must go back, just a little, to the world she was born into. Because the England of 1510 was not the England of legend. It was not yet the England of empire, of Shakespeare, of global exploration and Protestant Reformation, and all the grand machinery of a nation finding its place at the center of the world. It was, in many respects, still a kingdom finding its footing, bruised by decades of civil war, cautious, inward-looking, a country that had spent much of the previous century fighting itself, and had only recently, within living memory in fact, managed to stop. The Wars of the Roses had ended in 1485, when a Welsh-born nobleman of uncertain claim to the throne had defeated the last Plantagenet king on a battlefield in Leicestershire and declared himself Henry VII of England. He was a careful man, Henry VII, a watchful man. He rebuilt the royal finances with the patience of an accountant and the ruthlessness of a survivor, and he left his kingdom, when he died in 1509, in considerably better shape than he had found it. But he was not a man of grand gestures. He was not a man who dreamed of glory. His son was a very different creature altogether. Henry VIII came to the throne at 17 years old, and from the very first days of his reign it was clear to everyone around him that something had changed. He was tall, broad-shouldered, brilliantly educated, fluent in several languages, a fine musician, a passionate jouster, and possessed of an appetite for life, for food, for sport, for ideas, for admiration, that filled every room he entered. He had grown up watching his father govern carefully, quietly, without flair, and he had resolved, in the way that young men often resolve against their fathers, to be something altogether grander. He wanted to be a warrior king. He wanted to be spoken of in the same breath as Henry V, the hero of Agincourt. He wanted France. He wanted glory. And he wanted, in a manner that his father had never particularly troubled himself with, a navy. This is the crucial point. England, at the dawn of the 16th century, had no permanent royal navy to speak of. This is a fact that surprises many people, given England's later reputation as the supreme naval power in the world. But in 1509, the Royal Navy as an institution barely existed. When the Crown needed warships, it hired them, or borrowed them, or requisitioned merchant vessels and mounted guns on them and sent them to sea and hoped for the best. The idea of a standing fleet of purpose-built royal warships, maintained in peacetime and ready for war, was still in its infancy. Henry VIII changed that. Almost immediately upon taking the throne, he began commissioning warships, not converted merchant vessels, not hired foreign hulls. Purpose-built fighting ships, designed from the outset to carry heavy armament and project English power across the waters of the Channel and beyond. It was a program of naval construction that had no real precedent in English history, and it was driven, as so much of Henry's early reign was driven, by the fierce competitive energy of a young king who wanted the world to take him seriously. The Mary Rose was one of the first fruits of that program. She was ordered, most historians believe, around 1510, in the very first years of Henry's reign, and she was built, most likely at Portsmouth, though some evidence suggests a Thames side yard. Over a period of roughly a year, she was launched in 1511, and she was, from the moment of her completion, one of the largest and most heavily armed warships in the English fleet. Her name most probably honored the Virgin Mary, a common dedication for ships of the period, with the rose serving as the Tudor emblem, the symbol of the dynasty that Henry represented. She was, in other words, named as a declaration. This ship is ours. This ship is England. This ship is the new Tudor order made real in timber and iron. And what a ship she was. At her original construction, the Mary Rose displaced somewhere in the region of 500 tons. A substantial vessel for the period, though not the largest afloat in European waters. She carried a mixed armament of bronze and iron guns, arranged across multiple decks, and she could accommodate a crew of several hundred men. But it is worth dwelling for a moment on what the word warship meant in this period, because it was changing, rapidly, fundamentally changing, in ways that the Mary Rose embodied and helped to define. For most of the medieval period, the warship had been, at its core, a transport, a platform for soldiers. You filled it with armed men, you sailed it toward the enemy, you tried to get close enough to board, and then the battle was decided in the same way a land battle was decided, by men hacking at each other with swords and axes in close quarters. The ship itself was merely the vehicle. The men were the weapon. What changed this, what changed everything, was the gun. Gunpowder artillery had been in use on land since the 14th century, and small firearms had been carried on ships for some time, before Henry VIII came to the throne. But mounting heavy artillery aboard a ship presented serious technical challenges. A cannon is a heavy, ungainly object that produces a violent recoil when it fires. Placing heavy guns high on the upper decks of a ship, or at the bow and stern, was manageable enough, but it raised the center of gravity and made the vessel unstable. And the truly heavy guns, the ones that could batter another ship to pieces at range, were simply too cumbersome to handle in any useful way, given the existing arrangements. The solution that emerged in the early 16th century, and the Mary Rose was among the earliest warships in the world to embody it, was the gun port. The idea was deceptively simple, and yet its implications were enormous. Instead of placing guns on top of the ship, you cut openings in the side of the ship's hull itself, close to the waterline, and you ran your guns out through those openings. The guns sat low, where the weight was manageable and the stability of the vessel was not compromised. A hinged lid, the gun port, could be closed in rough weather to keep the sea out and opened when the guns needed to be brought to bear. And because you could fit multiple guns along the length of the ship on either side, you could now deliver a broadside, a simultaneous discharge of every gun on one flank of the vessel, with devastating effect. This was not a refinement of naval warfare. It was a revolution in it. A ship that could stand off at several hundred yards and deliver a broadside of heavy iron shot into an enemy hull did not need to close for boarding. It did not need soldiers massed on its decks. It could destroy from a distance in a way that no warship before it had been capable of doing. The Mary Rose, in her early configuration, was among the first vessels anywhere in the world to demonstrate what this new kind of warship could achieve. And she was given the opportunity to prove it almost immediately. Within a year of her launch, England was at war with France. Or rather, Henry VIII had engineered himself into a war with France as part of the complex alliance politics of early 16th century Europe that need not detain us too long here, except to note that Henry wanted to fight, and found reasons to do so. In 1512, the Mary Rose sailed as part of an English fleet to the waters off Brest, on the northwest coast of France, where a significant engagement took place with the French Navy. The details of that battle are somewhat obscure, as the details of most early Tudor naval engagements tend to be, but the Mary Rose acquitted herself well and returned to England with her reputation intact. The following year, 1530, brought a more celebrated moment. In an engagement that the English sources describe with considerable satisfaction, the Mary Rose is credited with capturing or helping to destroy French vessels in the Channel, and her commander at the time, Sir Edward Howard, the Lord Admiral of England, fought with the kind of aggressive energy that Henry VIII admired and rewarded. Howard himself would die later that year in a reckless attack on the French galley fleet, but the Mary Rose continued to serve and to build the kind of institutional reputation that a well-run warship accumulates over years of competent service. She was, in those early years, everything Henry VIII had hoped she would be, a symbol of his new navy, a demonstration of English ambition rendered in oak and gun bronze, a ship that said, to France, to Spain, to the watching powers of Europe, England is here. England is capable. England is not to be dismissed. And she was only just beginning. The decades that followed would see the Mary Rose refitted, rebuilt, and returned to service again and again, surviving not only the hazards of war and weather, but the endless political upheavals of a reign that reshaped England from its very foundations. Through the breaking with Rome, through the dissolution of the monasteries, through the rise and fall of men like Wolsey and Cromwell, through wives married and discarded, and worse, through all of it, the Mary Rose endured. She aged in the way that good ships age, slowly, with dignity, requiring increasing care and attention, but still capable, still present, still part of the story. Until the summer of 1545, when the story changed. But before we come to that day, to that terrible sunlit afternoon on the Solent, we must understand who was aboard her, because the Mary Rose was not simply a vessel of timber and iron. She was a community. She was home to hundreds of men, each with a role, each with a name, each with a life that had brought him to that particular ship on that particular morning. It is time to meet the crew. Close your eyes for a moment, if you are somewhere that allows it, and try to imagine the smell. Not the smell of the sea, though that is there too, clean and sharp and present in every breath. Something older than that, something closer, the smell of hundreds of men living in a confined space of timber and rope and bilge water, of salted meat in barrels and hard biscuit going soft in the damp, of tar and unwashed wool and the particular sweetness of oak that has been wet and dried and wet again 100 times over. The smell of a working ship in the 16th century is something no amount of historical reading can fully prepare you for. It was, by any modern reckoning, overwhelming. And yet, for the men who lived aboard the Mary Rose, it was simply home. This is perhaps the first and most important thing to understand about the crew of the Mary Rose, and about the crews of Tudor warships in general. These were not men who experienced their ship the way a modern person might experience a workplace, somewhere you arrive at in the morning and leave behind in the evening. The ship was their entire world, their sleeping place and their dining hall and their workshop and their church. The boundaries of their daily existence were the boundaries of the hull that contained them, and within those boundaries, a society of remarkable complexity had organized itself, with its own hierarchies and customs and economies and, in its own way, its own culture. Let us begin at the top and work our way down. At the apex of the Mary Rose's social world stood her captain in the final years of her life, the years that led to that last morning in July 1545. That position was held by Sir George Carew, a man of genuine distinction. Carew came from a prominent West Country family with strong ties to the Tudor court. He was well-connected, ambitious, and by the standards of the age, educated and accomplished. He had been appointed to command the Mary Rose relatively recently, and there is some evidence to suggest that he was still finding his feet in the role when the ship made her final voyage. His uncle, Sir Gawain Carew, commanded another vessel in the same fleet that day, and one of the more poignant details that survives from contemporary accounts is a conversation, or an argument, depending on how you read it, between the two men, conducted across the water between their ships in the moments before disaster struck. Sir Gawain called out to his nephew, asking how he did, how he fared. Sir George called back that he had, in his own words, a sort of knaves whom he could not rule. It was, as it turned out, one of the last things he ever said. Below the captain came the master, the man responsible for the actual sailing of the ship, the practical navigation and seamanship that kept the vessel moving and alive. The captain commanded, the master sailed. This distinction between the gentleman officer who held social authority and the professional seaman who held technical authority was one of the defining tensions of Tudor naval command, and it was a tension that did not always resolve itself comfortably. The master of the Mary Rose and his officers would have been experienced, often rough-handed men who had spent their lives at sea, and who may not always have found it easy to defer to a captain whose pedigree outweighed his practical experience. Then came the soldiers. This is a fact that surprises many people encountering Tudor naval history for the first time. A significant proportion of the men aboard the Mary Rose were not sailors at all. They were soldiers, land soldiers, infantrymen, men whose trade was the blade and the bow, not the rope and the sail. On a warship of this period, the distinction between a military vessel and a troop transport was not always clear, because the ship was expected to do both things. She needed enough sailors to operate her, to work the sails and the rigging, to manage the guns, to keep her afloat and moving. But she also needed fighting men to board the enemy and to repel boarders in turn. In the 1545 muster, the official listing of the crew that has, miraculously, survived, the Mary Rose carried a complement of sailors, soldiers, and gunners, along with a small number of specialist officers and servants. The total number of men aboard on her final day has been estimated at somewhere between 400 and 500, though the precise figure remains a matter of some scholarly debate. Among those hundreds of men, the gunners occupied a particularly important role. They were specialists in a world that was still learning what specialists were, men who understood the temperamental and dangerous business of loading and firing heavy artillery at sea. Gunpowder was unpredictable. Guns could misfire, could burst, could set the ship ablaze in an instant if handled carelessly. The gunners of the Mary Rose were experienced men, almost certainly, who had developed through long practice the combination of speed and caution that the job demanded. They would have known their guns intimately, known which ones ran hot, which ones needed extra care, which ones had idiosyncrasies that no technical manual could explain, but that familiarity had taught them to anticipate. And then there were the archers. This is one of the details about the Mary Rose that lodges itself most firmly in the imagination, because it feels, from our vantage point, almost impossibly archaic. Among the dead recovered from the wreck of the Mary Rose were longbowmen, men who carried the English warbow, the great 6-foot yew bow that had decided battles at Crécy and Poitiers and Agincourt. aboard a warship that also carried cast bronze cannon. The longbow and the gun, side by side on the same deck, in the same conflict. It is a remarkable image, and it tells us something important about the 16th century that we sometimes forget. That historical periods do not change all at once. They change gradually, unevenly, with the new and the old existing in parallel for far longer than we might expect. The gunner and the archer of the Mary Rose were not representatives of different eras. They were colleagues. The longbows recovered from the wreck, and there were many of them, nearly 140 in total, are among the most extraordinary finds in British archaeological history. They are vast things, these bows. Many of them are between 6 and 6.5 feet in length, and the draw weight required to use them effectively has been estimated at somewhere between 180 pounds. To put that in perspective, a modern competition recurve bow draws at around 50 pounds. These were instruments of extraordinary physical demand, and the men who used them, the skeletons of some of whom have been examined by physical anthropologists, show the skeletal adaptations that a lifetime of archery produces: enlarged left arms, asymmetrical muscle attachments, spinal curvatures consistent with years of drawing a heavy bow. Their bodies had been shaped, literally and permanently, by their profession. They are perhaps the most intimate detail the Mary Rose has given us. Not kings or admirals or great men of state, archers, working men whose names we mostly do not know, but whose bodies tell us with quiet precision what their lives had been. Below decks, the daily life of the crew was governed by routine and necessity. The ship was divided into messes, small groups of men who ate together, who shared rations drawn from the ship's stores, who looked out for each other in the way that people who depend on each other always do. The food was not, by any modern standard, pleasant. Salted beef and salt pork, parred ship's biscuit, which was a bread baked dry to prevent molding, and which was shared, inevitably, with the weevils that found their way into every ship's stores regardless of effort. Dried peas, occasional fish. Beer, always beer because water did not keep well in barrels, and beer at least remained drinkable for weeks at sea, even if it grew increasingly flat and sour as time went on. Medical care, such as it was, fell to the ship's barber surgeon. The Mary Rose carried one, and his equipment, his syringe, his ointment jars, his bleeding equipment, his chests of medicaments, was recovered from the wreck in remarkable condition. It gives us a picture of Tudor medicine that is simultaneously impressive and sobering. Impressive because the Tudor barber surgeon was not a quack, but a trained professional, working within the best medical understanding of his age. Sobering because that understanding was, by later standards, profoundly limited. Infection was not understood. Antisepsis was centuries away. Surgery was performed without anesthetic, and the chief virtues required of a surgical patient were courage and the ability to remain still. What the men had, in the absence of much else, was faith. The Mary Rose almost certainly carried a chaplain, and the spiritual life of the crew would have been woven into the daily rhythm of shipboard existence. Prayers at fixed hours, the marking of saints' days, the particular intensity of religious observance that seems always to accompany proximity to danger and death. These were men who lived, as all Tudor people lived, with a constant and intimate awareness of their own mortality. Plague, accident, violence, the simple caprice of the sea. Death was not a distant abstraction for them. It was a neighbor. And yet, they lived. They joked and gambled. The dice found aboard the Mary Rose are a small, lovely detail, tiny cubes of bone that once rattled across the deck of an evening. They played music. A tabor pipe was recovered from the wreck. They fought among themselves, no doubt, and reconciled and looked out for one another and built the small, dense, intricate social world that human beings always build when they are confined together long enough. They were a community, 400 men, perhaps 500, living at close quarters on a ship of oak and iron, sailing in the service of a king who watched from the shore. And in the summer of 1545, they sailed into the last morning of their lives. There are days in history that arrive without announcement, no drum roll, no darkening of the sky, no sign, visible to the people living through them, that this particular morning is different from any other, that the hours unfolding around them carry within them something that will be remembered, mourned, and studied for centuries to come. The people of those days wake up and eat their breakfast and go about their business, and the catastrophe or the miracle or the turning point arrives in its own time, indifferent to their expectations. The 19th of July, 1545, was such a day. It had begun, by all accounts, as a morning of purpose and even pride. The situation that had brought the English fleet to the waters of the Solent was a serious one. A French invasion fleet of considerable size had appeared in the Channel, the largest French naval force to threaten English shores in living memory. King Francis I of France, Henry VIII's great rival and occasional ally, and persistent antagonist across 4 decades of Tudor foreign policy, had assembled somewhere in the region of 200 ships and perhaps 30,000 men, with the stated intention of landing on English soil and settling, once and for all, the question of which monarch held the upper hand in the long, exhausting competition between their 2 kingdoms. It was, by any measure, a formidable threat, and Henry VIII had come south to meet it personally. The king was at Portsmouth. He had ridden down to oversee the defense of his kingdom and to be present, visibly, unmistakably present, at what might be a decisive moment in his reign. He was 53 years old by this point, vastly different in body from the golden young prince who had commissioned the Merry Rose 35 years before. The years had not been kind to Henry in the physical sense. He was enormously heavy now, afflicted with leg ulcers that caused him constant pain, increasingly immobile and irascible and difficult. But his will was undiminished. His determination to be seen as a warrior king, even when he could no longer ride into battle himself, remained as fierce as ever. He would watch. He would be witnessed watching. And his fleet would sail out and drive the French away, and England would be safe, and the legend of Henry VIII would be maintained. The night before the engagement, Henry had dined aboard the Mary Rose. This detail survives in the sources, and it is worth pausing on. The King of England had sat at table on the very ship that would sink the following day, had eaten and drunk and spoken with Sir George Carew, and perhaps with other officers, had seen the ship from the inside and found her, presumably, impressive. There is something almost unbearable in that detail, in retrospect. The king dining aboard his doomed flagship, the last supper, in its way, of a community of men. The morning of the 19th brought fair weather, a light wind, good visibility across the Solent, that stretch of water roughly 5 miles wide between Portsmouth and the Isle of Wight. The French fleet was visible, had been visible for days, maneuvering and probing, trying to find the right moment and the right approach. The English fleet, anchored in Portsmouth harbour and the surrounding waters, was preparing to move out and engage. The Mary Rose was among the first of the great ships to get underway. What happened next has been reconstructed, painstakingly, from a handful of surviving accounts, letters written in the days immediately following, depositions taken from survivors, the testimony of men who watched from shore or from other vessels. The picture they give is not entirely consistent, as eyewitness accounts rarely are, but certain elements appear in enough sources to be treated with reasonable confidence. As the Mary Rose moved out from her anchorage and began to maneuver into position, she turned. This was a routine naval maneuver, turning to bring her guns to bear, adjusting her heading in preparation for an engagement with the French fleet. But as she turned, something went wrong. The ship heeled. She leaned in the way that sailing vessels lean when the wind catches their sails in a turn, and the lean became a list, and the list did not correct itself. Instead, it deepened, and as it deepened, the sea began to come in. The gun ports. This is the cruel irony at the heart of the Mary Rose's sinking. The same innovation that had made her so formidable as a warship, the gun ports that allowed her to carry broadside artillery low in the hull, became the mechanism of her destruction. The gun ports on her lower deck had been opened in preparation for action. The guns were run out, or being run out, their muzzles pointing toward the French fleet across the water. And when the ship heeled in her turn, those open ports dipped toward the surface of the sea, and the sea, indifferent and implacable, poured in. Once water begins to enter a ship in significant quantities, the process that follows is devastatingly fast. The incoming water adds weight, which increases the list, which brings more ports closer to the water, which allows more water to enter, which adds more weight. It is a cascade, a feedback loop with only one possible ending. The Mary Rose, once she began to go, went quickly. Contemporary accounts suggest the whole process, from the initial healing to the final disappearance beneath the surface, may have taken no more than a few minutes. Some accounts suggest less. 400 men, perhaps 500, had minutes to find a way off a ship that was tilting, filling, and sinking beneath them. Most did not make it. The reasons for this are heartbreaking to contemplate. The Mary Rose, in preparation for battle, had her anti-boarding netting rigged across her upper decks. Heavy rope netting designed to prevent enemy soldiers from swarming aboard in a boarding action. In the chaos of the sinking, this netting became a death trap. Men trying to climb up and over the sides of the steeply listing ship found themselves tangled in the netting, unable to get free, unable to reach the surface as the ship went down around them. The same precaution that was meant to protect them in battle killed them in the disaster. There were survivors. The precise number is uncertain. Estimates vary between 25 and 40 men, out of a complement that may have been 10 times that. They were men who had been in the right place at the right moment, near enough to the surface, clear of the netting, strong enough swimmers to make it to the boats and the rescue craft that moved frantically across the water in the minutes and hours after the sinking. Their survival was, in the language of the sea, a matter of luck rather than merit or preparation. The sea does not distinguish between the deserving and the undeserving. It simply takes what the moment gives it. From the shore, those watching saw everything. King Henry, the accounts tell us, heard the screams. This is the detail that has lodged itself most firmly in the popular imagination of this event, and perhaps rightly so. The screams of the men trapped in the netting, in the rigging, in the lower decks of a ship that was tilting and filling and going down. Those sounds carried across the summer water to the shore where the King of England stood. One account, written not long after the event, describes the anguish of a woman on shore who recognized that her husband was aboard, and who watched and screamed herself as the ship went down. She was the wife of Sir George Carew. She watched the Mary Rose take her husband to the bottom of the Solent within sight of the English coast on a clear July morning with the king standing nearby. Sir Gawain Carew, who had spoken with his nephew from the deck of his own vessel just before the disaster, survived. He gave testimony about what he had seen. The conversation he described, Sir George's complaint about his knaves, he could not rule, has been interpreted in various ways by historians over the years. Some have taken it as evidence of an undisciplined crew, men who failed to respond properly to orders in the critical moments of the turn. Others have suggested it was nothing more than the kind of exasperated remark that any commander might make about the ordinary frustrations of managing large numbers of men. Whether crew discipline played a role in the sinking is a question that the evidence does not definitively answer. What the evidence does suggest, and what 5 centuries of subsequent analysis, including the detailed examination of the wreck itself, has largely confirmed is that the Mary Rose was probably overloaded. She had been refitted and rebuilt over her long career, her armament increased, her hull modified, and there is a persuasive argument that by 1545 she was carrying more weight than her original design had been intended to accommodate. A heavier ship sits lower in the water. Lower in the water means the gun ports are closer to the surface. Closer to the surface means that a degree of heel that might have been harmless in her youth became, in her middle age, fatal. She was brought down, in the end, not by the French, not by enemy fire or boarding action or the violence of battle. She was brought down by the accumulated weight of her own history, by the modifications and additions of 34 years of service, by an open gun port and an unlucky turn, and a few minutes in which everything went wrong at once. The French fleet, watching from across the water, reportedly cheered. The English fleet watched in silence as the mast of the Mary Rose, the last part of her to remain above the surface, slipped beneath the Solent and was gone. And King Henry VIII, on the shore of the kingdom he had spent his life defending and reshaping and fighting for, stood and watched his ship go down and heard the screaming stop. The sea is a patient keeper of secrets. It does not advertise what it holds. It does not mark the places where history has come to rest on its floor, does not place a sign above the wreck or the sunken cargo or the bones of the lost. It simply closes over what has fallen into it and continues. Tide following tide, season following season, the surface of the water as blank and indifferent as it was the moment before the thing went in. Whatever the sea takes, it keeps on its own terms, in its own way, according to its own slow and entirely impersonal processes of preservation and decay. And yet, and this is the thing that makes maritime archaeology so extraordinary, so unlike almost any other branch of the discipline, the sea sometimes preserves what the land would long since have destroyed. Wood rots in air, metal rusts, fabric dissolves, but under the right conditions, buried in the right kind of sediment, sealed away from the oxygen that drives most processes of biological decay, objects can survive on the seabed for centuries in a state that would be simply impossible anywhere above the waterline. The sea is a patient keeper of secrets, but it is also, under the right circumstances, a remarkably faithful one. The Mary Rose was fortunate in this regard, extraordinarily fortunate. But before we come to what the seabed preserved, we must first trace the long, strange history of the ship between the moment she sank in July 1545 and the moment she was rediscovered in the 20th century, because that history is not simply a blank, not simply 4 centuries of unbroken silence. There were people who knew she was there. There were people who tried to reach her. And there was a long, slow process of forgetting that is, in its own way, as interesting as the sinking itself. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, the English crown did not simply accept the loss of one of its most valuable warships. Within days of the sinking, efforts were underway to recover what could be recovered. The Venetian salvage experts were brought in. Venice being, in the 16th century, the acknowledged European master of maritime engineering and salvage technique. And a serious attempt was made to raise the hull. Contemporary documents describe the use of pontoons, of cables passed beneath the hull, of coordinated efforts to lift the ship bodily from the bottom and reflate her. The attempts failed. The reasons are not entirely clear from the surviving records, but the most likely explanation is a combination of the depth at which the Mary Rose had settled, around 40 meters, enough to make diving operations in this period extremely hazardous and limited, and the fact that the hull had already begun to embed itself in the soft sediment of the Solent floor. The ship was stuck, and the technology of the 1540s, impressive as it was in other respects, was not equal to the task of freeing her. Some salvage was achieved. The Mary Rose's masts projected above the waterline for some time after the sinking, and equipment attached to or near those masts. Rigging, perhaps some deck fittings, could be recovered without diving. There is also evidence that some of her bronze guns, which were enormously valuable, were recovered in the years immediately after the sinking, either by the Venetian salvors or by subsequent efforts. Bronze was precious. It could be melted down and reused. The practical Tudor mind did not leave expensive metal on the seabed if it could be helped. But the hull itself remained, and as the decades passed, and the salvage attempts quietly ceased, and the men who had known the Mary Rose and served aboard her and lost friends on that July morning grew old and died, the ship settled deeper into the sediment, and the sediment settled over the ship, and the Solent went on doing what the Solent has always done, running its tides twice daily over the past, covering it with silt and time and the patient accumulation of years. By the 17th century, the precise location of the wreck had become uncertain. By the 18th century, it had been largely forgotten. The Mary Rose was still mentioned in historical records. She appeared in chronicles of Henry VIII's reign, in accounts of his naval program, in occasional references to the disaster of 1545. But as a name in a document, rather than as a physical object that still existed somewhere beneath the water, the idea that the ship herself, or any significant part of her, might still be recoverable, was not one that anyone appears to have seriously entertained. Wood, most people assumed, did not survive on the seabed for a century, let alone 2 or 3. The Mary Rose was history. History was the past. And the past, by definition, was gone. This assumption, widespread, reasonable, almost entirely wrong, persisted until the middle of the 20th century. The first modern hint that the Mary Rose might still be there came in 1836, when fishermen working in the Solent found their nets snagging on something on the seabed at a location roughly a mile off the coast near Portsmouth. A local diver named John Dean, who was already something of a pioneer in the developing field of underwater exploration, having invented an early form of diving helmet, went down to investigate. What he found was timber, old timber clearly, heavily embedded in the seabed, but unmistakably the structural remains of a large wooden vessel. Dean and his associates made several dives over the following years and recovered a number of objects, bronze guns, wooden artifacts, various items of equipment, before the site was again lost and forgotten. Dean believed, on the basis of the gun's style and the nature of the timbers, that he had found the Mary Rose. He was almost certainly correct, but the technology to do anything significant with that discovery did not exist in the 1840s, and the site, without permanent markers or modern positioning equipment, was once again lost when Dean moved on to other projects. Another century passed. Then, in 1965, a young historian and amateur diver named Alexander McKee began what he called, with characteristic determination, Project Solent Ships. McKee was convinced, on the basis of historical research, of the earlier records of Dean's dives, and of his own reading of the Solent's geography and tidal patterns, that the Mary Rose was still down there, still largely intact, still, potentially, recoverable. His colleagues in the diving world were, for the most part, skeptical. The prevailing view remained that a wooden ship could not have survived nearly 4.5 centuries on the seabed in any meaningful form. McKee disagreed. He was one of those people, history is full of them, and we should be grateful for everyone, who are simply not discouraged by the consensus of the sensible. Working with a small team of volunteer divers and later in collaboration with Dr. Margaret Rule, an archaeologist who brought professional rigor to what had begun as an amateur enterprise, McKee spent years systematically searching the seabed in the area where the historical and documentary evidence suggested the Mary Rose should be. The Solent is not an easy place to search underwater. The visibility is poor, the tides are strong, and the silt that covers the seabed is fine and easily disturbed. Diving conditions are, even today, frequently challenging. But in 1971, after 6 years of searching, they found her. The initial discovery was modest: a section of exposed timber, a few artifacts protruding from the silt, but it was enough. Further investigation confirmed that what lay beneath the sediment was not merely a scatter of debris, but a substantial section of the Mary Rose's hull, preserved in the anaerobic, oxygen-free mud of the Solent floor in a condition that was, by any reasonable standard, astonishing. The reason for this extraordinary preservation lies in the particular character of the seabed at that location. When the Mary Rose sank, she settled on her starboard side, her right side, and the port side of the hull. The side that faced upward was gradually exposed to the currents and the biological activity of the open seabed, and was consumed, eaten by the creatures and processes that break down organic material in the marine environment. But the starboard side, the side pressed into the silt, was rapidly covered. The fine sediment of the Solent floor sealed it away from oxygen, and without oxygen, the bacteria and organisms that cause decay cannot function. The wood was locked in a kind of suspended animation. The artifacts within the ship, the possessions of the crew, the equipment of the vessel, the personal belongings of 400 men, were similarly sealed, similarly preserved. What remained was, in effect, a cross-section of the ship, a time capsule. One side of the Mary Rose, from keel to the level of the main deck, preserved very nearly as it had been on the morning of July 19th, 1545, waiting in the dark and the cold and the silence for someone to come and find it. And as the divers went deeper into the excavation through the 1970s, and the silt was carefully, painstakingly removed, and the scale of what had been preserved became apparent, the thousands of artifacts, the structural timbers, the personal belongings, the human remains, the scientific world began to understand that this was not simply a shipwreck. This was an archive, the most complete, the most intimate, the most human archive of Tudor life that had ever been found. The question now was whether it could be raised, whether a hull that had survived 4 centuries on the seabed could survive the journey back to the surface and to the world that had, for so long, forgotten it was there. There is a particular kind of courage that does not announce itself. It is not the courage of the battlefield, loud and immediate and witnessed by the crowd. It is the quieter kind, the courage of the person who commits, fully and without guarantee, to a task whose difficulty they understand completely, whose risks they have measured as carefully as measurement allows, and who proceeds anyway, not because they are unafraid, but because they have decided that the thing is worth doing, regardless of the fear. The people who raised the Mary Rose had that kind of courage. By the late 1970s, the excavation of the wreck had progressed to the point where the true scale of what lay on the Solent floor was becoming clear. The hull was not a scatter of timbers. It was a structure, coherent, substantial, the preserved remains of roughly half of a Tudor warship, sitting at an angle in the silt, containing within it an almost incomprehensible wealth of historical material. Dr. Margaret Rule, who had become the lead archaeologist on the project, and Alexander McKee, whose stubborn, visionary determination had found the ship in the first place, both understood by this point that excavation alone was not enough. If the Mary Rose was to be fully understood, if everything she contained was to be properly studied and preserved and shared with the world, she needed to come up. The entire hull needed to be raised. This had never been done before, not with a vessel of this size, this age, this fragility, and this archaeological significance. There were modern precedents for raising ships. The Swedish warship Vasa, which had sunk in Stockholm harbour in 1628, had been raised in 1961 in an operation that the Mary Rose team studied carefully. But the Vasa had been in considerably better structural condition, in shallower water, in a more accessible location, and had benefited from a different set of technical circumstances. The Mary Rose presented her own unique challenges, and the team knew it. The operation was placed under the management of the Mary Rose Trust, a charitable organization established specifically for the purpose, with Margaret Rule as its archaeological director. Funding came from a combination of private donations, corporate sponsorship, and public support. Prince Charles, who had dived on the wreck himself in 1975 and become a passionate advocate for the project, served as the Trust's president and lent the operation a degree of royal visibility that helped enormously with fundraising and public awareness. The nation, as it became aware of what was happening on the floor of the Solent, became invested. The Mary Rose was not just an archaeological project. She was becoming something more, a national story, a story about memory and loss and recovery, about the relationship between a country and its past. The technical plan, developed over years of careful engineering work, was extraordinary in its ambition and its precision. The hull could not simply be lifted from above. The wood, though preserved in the silt, was saturated with water. It had been for 4.5 centuries, and in that waterlogged state it was, paradoxically, both intact and deeply fragile. Waterlogged wood retains its shape as long as it remains wet, but if it is allowed to dry unevenly, or if it is subjected to stresses it cannot bear, it will crack and collapse and lose the very structure that 4 centuries of preservation had maintained. The hull had to be supported from within as well as from without. It had to be lifted with a perfectly distributed, perfectly controlled cradle of steel that would hold it exactly as it lay, preventing any twisting or flexing that might cause damage. A steel lifting frame was constructed and lowered to the seabed. Divers and the diving team's work throughout this phase of the operation deserves more recognition than it typically receives. Hundreds of hours of difficult work in the poor visibility and strong tides of the Solent attached the frame to the hull with a network of bolts and brackets and supporting beams, threading them through the structure of the ship with painstaking care, working around the artifacts and the timbers and the human remains that were still present within the hull. The lift was planned for October 1982. As the date approached, the attention of the nation, and, through television coverage that was broadcast internationally, much of the watching world, turned to a patch of sea off the coast of Portsmouth. The BBC mounted a live broadcast. Cameras were positioned on boats around the site. The operation had the quality of a space launch, a great technical enterprise conducted in public, with all the tension and all the possibility of failure that public enterprise carries with it. On the 11th of October 1982, the lift began. The crane barge, Togmore, its name meaning Big Lift in Scottish Gaelic, a name that now seems almost too perfectly chosen, took the strain. The cables tightened. The frame, with the hull of the Mary Rose cradled within it, began to move, slowly, incrementally, with an almost unbearable slowness born of the need for absolute control. 4 centuries of silt releasing its grip on 4 centuries of oak. The sea, that patient keeper of secrets, reluctantly returning what it had held. And then she was clear. The hull of the Mary Rose, dark with centuries of immersion, streaming with water, hung in the air above the surface of the Solent for the first time since July 1545. The cameras caught it, the watching crowds on the shore, the people on the boats, the millions watching on television screens across the country saw it. A ship from Tudor England, hanging in the October light, dripping, dark, impossibly present. The moment was watched by an estimated 60 million people worldwide. It remains one of the most viewed live archaeological events in history. The hull was transferred to a specially prepared dry dock at Portsmouth Historic Dockyard, where it was placed in a conservation cradle, and the long, slow process of preservation began. Waterlogged wood, as noted, is fragile. It cannot simply be allowed to dry. Instead, it must be treated over a period of years. In the Mary Rose's case, decades, with a chemical called polyethylene glycol, or PEG, a waxy substance that is absorbed into the wood fibers and gradually replaces the water molecules that have kept the timber intact for centuries. As the water is replaced by PEG, the wood stabilizes, loses its fragility, and can eventually be allowed to dry without collapsing. The treatment of the Mary Rose's hull took the better part of 30 years. From 1994, the ship was housed in a specially built museum at Portsmouth, where visitors could see her through a viewing screen while the treatment continued. The hull, kept in a carefully controlled environment, sprayed continuously with a fine mist of PEG solution, drying and stabilizing with an almost geological slowness. In 2013, the spraying was finally stopped. The hull declared sufficiently stable to be displayed in open air. A new museum building, designed specifically around the hull and the thousands of artifacts recovered with her, opened to the public in the same year. For the first time since 1545, the Mary Rose was fully visible. Not through a screen, not in pieces, but whole, in a space designed to show her as she deserved to be shown, and the things she had brought back with her from the seabed. Here is where the story of the Mary Rose expands beyond the story of a single ship and becomes something larger and stranger and more affecting than almost any other archaeological discovery in British history. Because what the Solent had preserved inside that hull was not simply a collection of interesting objects. It was a world, an entire, detailed, intimate portrait of Tudor life, as it was actually lived by ordinary people, not the kings and the courtiers and the great men whose lives are documented in the archives, but the soldiers and the sailors and the gunners and the surgeons and the archers, the working people of the 16th century whose daily existence is otherwise almost entirely invisible to us. Consider what was found. Nearly 19,000 individual artifacts recovered from the wreck over the course of the excavation. Longbows and arrows, musical instruments, navigational equipment. The surgeon's chest, with its contents still organized, still arranged, one might almost say, as if the surgeon had just stepped away and would return shortly to continue his work. Leather shoes, the shapes of individual feet pressed into them by decades of wear. Wooden plates and bowls, combs, pocket sundials for telling the time, a backgammon set, velvet caps, the remains of food, seeds, animal bones, fish scales, that tell us what the men ate and where some of the provisions had originally come from. A knit comb, small and personal and almost unbearably human, that tells us, wordlessly and precisely, about the realities of communal life on a 16th century warship. And the bones, the skeletal remains of at least 179 individuals recovered from within the hull. Each one a man who had been alive on the morning of July 19th, 1545. Each one examined, studied, and where possible returned to something approaching dignity. Physical anthropologists have been able to tell us, from those bones, extraordinary things. The ages of the men, ranging from teenagers to men in their 50s. Their health, the arthritis, the healed injuries, the dental problems that were almost universal in an age before modern dentistry. Their origins. Isotope analysis of the bones can indicate where a person grew up by comparing the chemical signature of the local water in their tooth enamel to known geographic profiles. And some of the Mary Rose's crew, it appears, were not English at all. They were Flemish, or Spanish, or from other corners of Europe, men who had found their way, by whatever route, to Portsmouth and into the service of Henry VIII and onto a ship that sailed on its last morning. The Mary Rose did not just survive. She remembered. She remembered in extraordinary, specific, human detail. She remembered the weight of a man's shoe and the shape of a woman's comb he might have carried from home. She remembered the discipline of the surgeon and the recreation of the gambler and the devotion of the musician. She remembered the names written on the possessions of the officers and the anonymous bodies of the men who had no names attached to them, only bones, only the mute testimony of a skeleton that once moved and breathed and ate and slept and looked out across the water of the Solent on a morning in the summer of 1545. She is there now, in Portsmouth, in the museum built around her, the dark curve of her hull rising in the climate-controlled air, the artifacts arranged in the galleries around her, the names of the known dead listed where visitors can read them. She is visited by hundreds of thousands of people every year. Children who press their faces to the glass and ask their parents what that is, and adults who stand quietly for a moment longer than they planned, caught by something they perhaps did not expect to feel. She is a ship, she is a grave, she is a document, she is a mirror. She shows us, across 5 centuries, who we were, how we lived, what we carried with us, how quickly, on a clear morning with a fair wind, everything can change. The Mary Rose sank in minutes. She was mourned by a king. She was forgotten for centuries. She was found by a stubborn man who refused to believe she was gone. She was raised before 60 million watching eyes, and she was given back, finally, to the country that built her and lost her and remembered her. Imperfectly, incompletely, but in the end, faithfully. Some ships carry cargo. Some ships carry soldiers. Some ships carry trade goods across the water from one world to another. The Mary Rose carried time, and time, it turns out, was enough.